All right, so the Rocky Mountain Element. It's a lot like a salted chocolate chip cookie. At first, it seems like a really weird combination, but the two go together really, really well. Except in the case of the Element, we're not talking about salt and sugar. It's all mountain geometry and XC feeling suspension. The Element has the geometry of a much bigger, rowdier, more capable bike with the quick, fast, efficient suspension of a little XC whip. So does it meet in the middle as the perfect trail bike, or is it just a hot, gooey mess? Stick around to find out. Full rub.
Get up on your feet, this is a shakedown.
So the Element has some of the most aggressive short bike geometry that I have ever seen. In fact, it's on par with bikes like the Ibis Ripmo, the Yeti SB130, the Santa Cruz Hightower, which all have a lot more travel than the 120mm Rocky Mountain Element. So it's as long and as slack as all of those bikes, except it has way less travel. And when you compare it to bikes that are closer in travel, say bikes like the Orbea Occam and the Giant Trance X29, it is way slacker and way longer than those bikes. So it's this really weird thing where you sit on it and it feels like a big, sturdy all-mountain bike, but then the suspension hits you and it's very XC. I honestly struggled to know how to ride this bike for the first couple of rides. I didn't know, do I ride it like a big bike? Do I ride it like a little XC bike? It took me quite a bit of time to get it figured out. Once I found out how to ride the bike, I ended up getting PRs both up and down the mountain. So now that I've spilled the beans, let's talk about how this thing rides. Alrighty, here we go. The Rocky Mountain Element. This is one of the more requested bikes we've had recently. This climb just really eases right into things. First few switchbacks are rough. So the very first thing I'm noticing here is it doesn't fit and feel like a little XC bike. It doesn't even fit like a little trail bike. Honestly, the fit, the size, it all kind of feels a little more all mountain than anything. This bike is so confusing to me right now because it feels like an all mountain bike but with less travel. And maybe that's what it's trying to be. All mountain geo, trail bike travel. Man, lots of traction, even for having a little ardent tire. When I stand up and kind of mash on the pedals on these steep bits, it's not sliding out. Oh yeah, this thing kind of goes. Finally got to a spot that's not super steep. We're a little more rolling in here. This thing rolls, it goes quick. I think the bike it's reminding me the most of right now is the transition spur. Motor's right over all of that. Not getting hung up at all. So really interesting feel on this bike. Still trying to get my head wrapped around it with the Geo and then the suspension. All right, so I was super impressed with this thing on the climbs. Very efficient, firm, fast pedaler. Geo felt pretty good. And now we're gonna get into the downhills a little bit here. See what we can do. I really like the Geo on this thing. You don't feel all timid and squirrely on the bike. Kind of feel like you can give it the beans a little bit. And somehow there is traction, man. Man, stable at speed. Really stable. Still pretty quick handling though. Responsive, but like not squirrely. This thing is really fast on this terrain, like quite possibly the fastest bike I've ridden. Oh, that corner is pretty silly. Super fun bike, plenty capable, plenty like sturdy and stout to go ride a lot of different terrain. Really fast, really efficient, firm, supportive. We're gonna head back to the garage, talk about who this bike's for, what it's good at, and if it's the right bike for you. It's really hard to find a benchmark to compare this bike against. Do you compare it against the big all-mountain bikes? Do you compare it against the XC bikes, trail bikes? I honestly don't know where to put it, so we're gonna call it a mountain bike, and we're gonna compare it to mountain bikes. For a mountain bike, it goes uphill very, very fast. There is absolutely no energy lost on the Element. It's quick, it's firm, it's efficient, and all of your effort goes into driving the bike forward. It doesn't lack all that much traction either, which was really surprising to me, especially given the tires that are on this bike. They are a lot faster rolling than tires that I normally ride. So I was expecting to break loose when I was standing up on steep, rough, loose, rocky bits, and it just didn't happen. I won't go as far as calling it plush because it's not even close. It's not a bike I would call active under pedaling forces either. It is very, very firm, very efficient, yet somehow it doesn't lack in traction. However, you do feel all of the rocks and roots and bumps while climbing. It does not do a ton in terms of smoothing those out. It is a bike that will force you to take smoother lines rather than going over the top of everything. So like I said earlier, the Element feels a lot like a bigger all-mountain bike in terms of fit and feel and body position. I will say the seat tube angle is probably as slack as I would go and still be in my comfortable range, which paired to a long reach does stretch you out just a little bit over the bike. I prefer to sit a little more upright than where this bike put me. Still not a deal breaker, still fairly comfortable. I did quite a few long days with no problems. That more stretched out or more rearward weight distribution will make that front end a little bit lighter when things get really, really steep. But like I said earlier, you can stand up, which corrects that, and still not slide out on the back wheel. The handling for me on the climbs was more all mountain than it was XC. It has that bigger kind of swing wider around switchbacks type feel to it rather than darting, ducking, diving, weaving through everything and getting around a corner really quick and easy. You do have to ride it a bit more like an all mountain bike going uphill, except you're just going way faster because that suspension is just way more efficient. So overall, on the climbs, I'm a really big fan of the Element. It's fast, it's quick, it's efficient, but it has kind of that longer wheelbase, more stable, smoother ride quality that comes from the long, slack geometry. Everything about this bike is to make it faster, and that really comes through on the climbs. Downhill on the Element is where I liked it the most. Again, it's a really odd combination of geometry and suspension, but it works really, really well together and ends up being really, really fast. The best way to describe the suspension on the Element on the downhills is firm. Not even close to plush. You do feel a lot of the trail. You feel the rocks, the roots, the bumps. You feel it all, but the suspension is very supportive and again, all about generating speed. Right off the top, it's not ultra plush and gooey. It's soft enough that there's a lot of traction, way more than I thought there would be, but definitely not what I would call plush. Mid-stroke and the end stroke are both, again, very firm. So when you're pumping through rollers and berms and corners, you're generating a lot of forward momentum. And again, the end stroke is firm, so there isn't a ton of bottoming out, especially considering this bike only has 120 millimeters of travel and you're riding it faster than most other 120 mil bikes. Considering how firm and efficient the suspension is, I thought it would have been amazing at getting airborne. And for me, it felt a bit more like the SB130, where the suspension is designed to make you go faster, not necessarily to make the bike feel ultra jibby and playful. The bike is not the most comfortable or smooth, especially when things get really, really rough. But again, it only has 120 millimeters of travel, and maybe it's unfair to say it's not ultra smooth in that stuff because it's really not designed for that. But you feel like it is because it kind of feels like an all-mountain bike. So again, it's a really hard bike to wrap your head around. But I will say, for only having 120 millimeters of travel, it does handle the bigger hits fairly well, especially on your standard features that you'd find on blues and easier black diamond trails. But the thing is, the bike wants more than that. It wants to go faster and it wants to ride rougher, nastier terrain. That geometry is what makes the bike so good on the downhill, is it's really long, really slack for the category and stable. So you end up maybe finding yourself getting into a little bit of trouble where you're going really, really fast in some rather difficult terrain. And then you find the end of the suspension. That's where you just have to close your eyes and hold on for dear life and hope you make it out the other side. And I'm not saying that's a fault of the bike. In fact, it's a praise that it allows you to ride that aggressively. Again, considering it only has 120 millimeters of travel. And I do think that makes this bike more versatile than a lot of other 120 mil bikes because it opens up that higher end or that more difficult trail category. In the corners, I really loved the Element. It is stable and long enough that it's smooth and it doesn't feel squirrely or that front wheel is going to tuck underneath you, but it's not so long that it feels like a school bus. So it ends up being a really good balance, or a really good middle ground for cornering. It's really easy just to pop this thing into a corner, lean it over, and rock it out the other side. So overall for me, the Element is all about speed on the downhill. It's not the most playful or jibby bike, but it is a very, very fast bike in a very wide variety of terrain, from easy, flowy, mellow trails to kind of rough and rugged trails. It's fast just about everywhere. All right, so we have a lot of comparisons here. I'm gonna run through them all very, very quickly, starting with the Revel Ranger. So I do think the Ranger is probably a tiny bit quicker uphill than the Element, although it's pretty close. But where the Ranger felt very XC on the downhills and a little less stable, the Element feels way more stable, and I didn't feel the need to kind of like tiptoe around sketchy features. I was able to just ride it like I would ride my normal bike. Next up, the Transition Spur. The Element feels a lot like the Spur. I think on the climbs you're maybe splitting hairs trying to differentiate the two, but on the downhill they both have that punch above their weight class type attribute to them. Although I think the Element packs a little bit more of a punch. It has a little bit slacker geometry and a little bit longer geometry, and I think the suspension does a little bit better job of smoothing out rough and rugged trails. Part of that could be that the Spur is spec'd with a RockShox SID fork, and the Element is spec'd with a Fox 34, so you do get a little more stout fork up front, which is going to help a lot when you're pushing the limits of a bike. Next up, we have the Santa Cruz Tallboy. The Element goes uphill way faster than the Tallboy, and I would probably put them very close to each other on the downhills, but they go about it totally different. The Tallboy is kind of softer, more plush, more comfortable, more jibby, really fun to ride. The Element relies on geometry a little bit more to let you ride rough stuff, so it's longer, slacker, but you kind of have to bring your A game if you're going to ride the really hard stuff. Now let's compare this to the Ibis Ritmo. Now hear me out, I know this is coming out of left field, but their geometry is very, very similar, almost identical. The Ritmo packs more of a punch with a lot more travel, but I don't think they're too far off in the types of terrain they can ride. The Ritmo is going to tackle it faster, obviously, with way more travel, but I think you could get away with riding your Element in the places or in the style where you'd ride your Ritmo. Element obviously goes uphill quite a bit quicker with faster rolling tires, a lighter overall build, and I don't think you pay a huge penalty on the downhill, but again, it is kind of comparing apples to oranges. So who is it for? I see the Element as a really good bike for two types of folks, and the first group are people like me. I normally ride bigger bikes, longer travel, a little bit slacker, longer. So when I get on a little XC bike, I get kind of weird and timid and rigid because I'm scared. They're way twitchier than the big bikes I'm used to. The Element is not that way. It has the benefits of a short travel, cross-country trail bike, but it fits, feels, and handles like a bigger all-mountain bike or an enduro bike like I'm used to. So if you're in the same boat, I think you'd really, really like the Element. The second group of riders who I think will enjoy this bike are the endurance racers. Rocky has always kind of built this bike as their BC bike race bike. And if you're at all familiar with BC bike race, it's stupid amounts of miles and vertical in the day, but you're riding some really rough British Columbia downhills. So you do need a bike that handles the technical, rough, rugged terrain. I think this bike is really good for that. Things like True Grit, great bike for that. You've got tough terrain, so you need a little bit of capability and stability, but you're also on the bike all freaking day. So you need a little bit of efficiency and quickness out of your bike. And the Element is just that. So wrapping this up really quickly so I can go eat more cookies, the Rocky Mountain Element, it's all about speed. Thanks for sticking around. We'll see you next time. I think I'm gonna need to do like 20 more takes of that. Those cookies are so good.